Waters of Amsterdam.
It's almost as if the rain is trying to get in.
It is.
What?
This rain isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon.
What do you mean?
Watch out! The window!
Behind me! All of you! Behind me!
They're forming out of the rain!
Ah, there you all are. I thought you might be in trouble. And it turns out I was completely right.
It's no use. Those things are everywhere.
Every canal, every storm drain, every dripping gutter, you may be right.
You are Mach-Teldak, of course, Valentine.
It's no good, we're surrounded.
You have been sentenced to execution.
Ready, all of you, when I say run, run.
Hello and welcome YouTubers and Doctor Who fanatics to a Big Finish audio review. And today I'll be taking a look at the first monthly range release for 2016, and it starts off the new 5th Doctor trilogy, The Waters of Amsterdam, by my favourite Big Finish writer, Jonathan Morris. So if you want to go straight to my review of The Waters of Amsterdam and don't want to see how it's presented, then there's the time on the bottom of the screen to the review. You have or haven't skipped, then let's begin the video. So for the front cover of The Waters of Amsterdam, we have the Nyx by here, the 5th Doctor, Tegan and Nyssa with this really nice water effect with Amsterdam and the canal in the background, with an orange light effect behind the characters, with brand new adventures, full cast audio drama with the standard stuff by here, the Doctor Who logo and the name of the story written by Jonathan Morris, with the Big Finish logo down by there, and then the audio adventures of Doctor Who. So here we have the spine of the CD, with the 5th Doctor picture by there, Doctor Who, The Waters of Amsterdam, 208 with the Big Finish logo. And for the back, the title of the story written by Jonathan Morris, directed by Jamie Anderson, running time 120 minutes approx, with the bio on the story and the cast featured in the story. Inside the CD we are presented with the leaflet and the disc, with part 1 and part 2, and part 3 and part 4, with advertisements for other 5th Doctor releases from 2014 and 2015. And then for the leaflet itself, we have the next installment, which is Accutane, which has already came out, which I'm very looking forward to, and reviews have been very solid for it. Doctor Who magazine and production credits. And if you want to, you can flip it over if you desire. And here is the comparison of the two variations of the leaflet. So now to my review of The Waters of Amsterdam by Jonathan Morris. Now this story picks up after the events of Arc of Infinity. Now I believe in the behind the scenes that Jonathan Morris took advantage of this, as he's a fan of the Arc of Infinity. Now it doesn't really look like his style, because Jonathan Morris is a very bleak and experimental writer. If you look at his BBC books, some of his Big Finish stuff, always very bleak and experimental. But occasionally he does go for a light-hearted story such as The Theatre of Dreams. Even though it's very experimental, it's a lot of fun. And this story definitely looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. Now sometimes that isn't really Jonathan Morris's style, as in the Antimatter. Even though I do like the story, it's not one of the best Jonathan Morris stories. And he doesn't hit the nail like he does with his bleak and experimental stories. And as well, if you looked at the monthly range for 2016, there's 4 5th Doctor stories starting out with the monthly range, which is Waters of Amsterdam, Accutane, the Peterloo assassination, and the one started with the Masters trilogy, which is And You Will Obey Me. I'm not the biggest fan of the 5th Doctor, so I'm a little bit on the whole idea. Not to get the wrong idea, still some of the stories are absolutely brilliant. I was sort of excited for this one because it has Jonathan Morris's name on it. Accutane definitely looks the most impressive. It looks very creepy, it does, and that's out, so I'm very looking forward to getting that one, just waiting for the CD to arrive. Peterloo assassination I'm a little bit worried for, because I'm not a fan of Paul Mars's psychedelic and crazy writing. He's a really crazy Doctor Who writer, yeah, he's a completely unique writer, I would absolutely agree with that, which is good. I'm not really a style of his writing. And You Obey Me definitely looks good. The Masters trilogy definitely looks very interesting. But yeah, the monthly range just starting out with Jonathan Morris. I'm happy, but it isn't really his style, what he usually goes for. Or his best style being bleak and experimental, something more fun. So I was thinking this may not be a classic Jonathan Morris story, or it could actually shine. So to the story, from the pre-title sequence, I knew already what Waters of Amsterdam was gonna do. Yeah, this story is a heavy Tegan story, as the pre-title sequence shows Tegan meeting up with her ex-boyfriend. I don't really mind Tegan, I don't hate the character as most people do. I don't love her, I don't like her, I just like meh. And from the really quirky soundtrack playing in the background, I knew this one's gonna be a little bit quirky and a fun adventure. Which I was a little bit worried, because Jonathan Morris is better at writing serious stories than fun stories. And yeah, when part 1 was released on the Big Finish website, I didn't really see like a great response to it. Some people thought, well, it's just really character driven with Tegan and that's it really, in the plot it's like microscopic at that point. So part 1 didn't really go down very well with people when it came out. It was just rather a character piece for Tegan, and she's moaning a lot in her previous travels in the TARDIS, and she's trying to get her voice out, so of course that might annoy some listeners, as Tegan really does talk a lot in episode 1, part 1. And we have all these flashback scenes connecting to Tegan, like how she lost her job, how she met Kyle, how their relationship started, how did it tremble. That's pretty much what happens in part 1. I can see the main plots with the Nyx creatures sort of creeping in slowly. You can just see it microscopically. Yeah, part 1 is just focusing on Tegan. Yeah, there's about 5 or 6 flashback scenes in like one track, so there's a lot of them. So part 1 is being driven by Tegan. That's the only thing driving the story, as the plot is barely visible. Where you can see the plot sort of creeping in is where Nyssa catches something on the corner of her eye in the canal, like the water moving very weird. And it has a really nice effect of dripping water because you know it's the Nyx. So it feels like a presence is in the story, so that's pretty good. So sound design, a lot of attention to detail. The 5th Doctor, Peter Davison, his voice acting in episode 1, it felt really stale and lifeless. Probably because nothing really interesting was happening in the story. The 5th Doctor wasn't really doing anything interesting in part 1, so that makes part 1 feel a little bit stale. So I think that's why people don't really like part 1. It doesn't really have a lot of drive to it, so it just feels really dry and stale, and you're just saying to yourself, I want the plot to creep in now, I don't really care for all this. So part 1 maybe could have been handled a little bit better. The main plot should have been kicked in a little bit faster and a little bit better in part 1. But yeah, the Nyx do get very quickly into the story. Not too much build up to them. It did feel like they had the presence in the story, so that was pretty well handled. As I said, the sound design, really good attention to detail, and that did sort of pick up the pace with part 1 a little bit. Still felt a little bit dry. And you know, we get some development with the monsters. They're not going for the locals, they're going right for the Doctor and saying, we are taking you. So obviously they're here for a reason. They're not going for the locals, so they want the Doctor for something. And what Jonathan Morris is very good is unpredictability, and with the Nyx I would say, yeah, it's quite unpredictable. But that goes into part 4, we're quite away from that. Part 1 is average, it's just average. It's not brilliant, it's not good, it's not terrible, it's not bad at all, it's just dead average. It just feels very dry and stale, and you're like, naff, you just naff. And with everyone who's listened to Waters of Amsterdam, everyone has seemed to say that with part 1. It's just, it has no movement, it has no drive, and the plot is just not very well built up to. And yeah, to me it feels pretty dry and stale. So it's starting out pretty average for a Jonathan Morris script. I don't really expect that, but he could pick it up. Part 2, we have more of an introduction to Tegan's ex-boyfriend, named as Kyle. He does feel like a main supporting character and a one-off companion in this release, and Kyle is very interested in the TARDIS, and the 5th Doctor is a little bit cautious of him, doesn't really trust him. There's more to him that meets the eye, is what the 5th Doctor's sort of thinking of him. As he's a little bit unsure of the 5th Doctor, he finds him very untrustworthy. So now the Doctor and the companions leave Amsterdam present time, and now they're going to Amsterdam in 1658 to see why Rembrandt did art on alien spaceships, and if there's anything with the Nyx, the water creatures. And we know again that they have a presence in episode 2, as already when they land, quite quickly they witness someone dead, and this person drowned and he was nowhere near the water, and the Nyx are capable of entering the body into the lungs and drowning you that way. Very scary way of how Nyx attack you, but that wasn't really done anymore. That was only really shown once, as it would get a little bit more fear factor out of the monsters, but they only really do that once, and we don't really see it or witness it. All we know is that this person died apparently from drowning, as his lungs were just completely clogged up with water. It would have been really nice to see that in action. It would bring a little bit of fear factor to the monsters, the Nyx. They're quite scary monsters, they are, as they can possess anything water. They can get into sinks, baths, sewer systems. They can affect the weather, the rain, anything water they can affect. So it's pretty good that Jonathan Morris has grabbed a common phobia, which is drowning, and used that as a weapon, as a lot of people fear drowning, so it was a really good idea. Yeah, part 2 I would say is a lot more better than part 1. Part 1 just felt a little bit stale, but plot 2 has a little bit more drive to it now. A little bit more epic scenes now with the Nyx coming into play. And the story does feel a little bit experimental. It's going to be quite paradoxical, and yeah, the story is a little bit paradoxical when it gets to part 4. But I could see this happening in episode 2 because I really know Jonathan Morris' style, and I can see he was going for more of a paradoxical sort of story. As in Amsterdam, the present time, the Nyx knew who the Doctor was, but in Amsterdam 1658, the Nyx don't know who the Doctor is. So of course in the middle of that time the Doctor did something. And we have an introduction to a really good supporting character which brings a lot of fun to the story, which is Rembrandt van Rijn, who is pretty funny. He's got a bit of a mood, doesn't really want to help the Doctor at all to find his companions. He brings a lot of comedy and fun to the story. His voice is very welcoming. His dialogue is very inviting, and immediately you just want to like the character. He's a lot of fun in the story. Brings a nice bit of comedy in the story. And we have Polsbrook, another character who is getting answers out of Tegan and Nyssa, thinking that they're aliens. And when Tegan and Nyssa tell the truth, then he says, oh right, you're expected. So it looked like he was turning out that he was going to be one of the bad guys, but really he wasn't, even though he was threatening them with torture devices. But it really made him out to be a really filthy villain. And yeah, he takes them to another character, which is Teldak. And from her voice, she's definitely from a different planet. She's an alien, and she's from a race called the Vorax. And yeah, Tegan is very cautious of her, doesn't really trust her a lot, and she doesn't really want to bring up anything about herself and Nyssa, but want to get answers out of her. And Teldak is very cooperative, and tells that the Nyx wiped out her planet with constant rain, which destroyed her planet, and the Nyx are after her. So now we do realise why the Nyx are on planet Earth. They're trying to hunt for the last remaining Vorax. But still, we don't really know why they want the Doctor. Yeah, the Nyx really remind me of a Jago and Lightfoot villain from Dead Men's Tales. They're not the same villain, but they sound and talk very similar. Yeah, part 2, it's a really good part. It's a very interesting tale. It's got some nice comedy. The Nyx feel like a threat, even though it could have been done a little bit better. Add some fear factor to them, but still they feel like a threat because Jonathan Morris grabbed a common phobia and uses it as a weapon, because drowning is a very common phobia. And Tegan's character moments, it wasn't too heavy in part 2, which was an absolute relief. That's really all in part 1. That's the heaviest amount you're going to get out of Tegan and Kyle. There's still bits in it with part 2, 3 and 4, but it's not as much as part 1 was literally in your face. Yeah, part 2 is getting better now, the story, which is great. Jonathan Morris has definitely gave the story a lot more drive now, as the plot is creeping in very well, and it's very interesting. Yeah, now to part 3. I'll go back to Kaya now. As I said, there is more to him that meets the eye, as the Doctor was very unsure about him, and also Rembrandt actually recognised him. As well, he can get rid of the Nyx very easily. So of course there is something more than him that meets the eye. It's not that huge, but I'll leave it to the listener, as there's some nice twists near the second half of the character. And yeah, it gives the reason of why Kyle found Tegan. It was a really nice moment in this story. I thought it was just absolutely fantastic writing. It was with Rembrandt's character. And he was talking to Nyssa about his financial trouble, and that he cannot sleep, and reflects in the past of his wife passing away. But life for him isn't very good or easy. He thinks to himself that, I don't feel like living anymore. And Nyssa also reflects on this as well, that she's lost her family and Traken, her homeworld. So they reflect on everything that they're lost. I find it really powerful character moments, and that's a really nice thing for Nyssa to have in the story. Nyssa isn't really a strong focus in the story. It's really, you know, Tegan taking the centre stage. But that was a really nice moment for the character Nyssa. In part 3, the plots with the Nyx was sort of fading away at times, and that could have been handled a little bit better because pacing turned out to be a bit of a problem. As this story is both plot driven and character driven, Jonathan Morris keeps swapping them around, which one's driving the story, and the character drive just isn't strong enough to push the story ahead. That's why the story doesn't have a lot of drive at times. But when it gets going, it's amazing. There's a really nice base under siege moment in Rembrandt's house as the Nyssa have found them and they're taking over the house now. They're breaking down the windows and coming down from the ceiling, and it starts out with them hearing dripping water. It's like a really mocking sound to them that we're here and we're gonna kill you. Again, the Nyssa really feel like a threat as they can swarm a house from all directions, not just from the windows, the doors, but they can come from the top of the roof. They can move on land, and of course they can possess water, so they do feel like a threat, especially at this stage of the story. It's really well handled. And we get a little bit more development of Teldak, who wants to go back to her homeworld to see if her whole race was destroyed. And then she witnesses that, yeah, her whole race was destroyed because the Doctor shows her. But then Teldred says she wants to go back to Amsterdam, present time, where the Fifth Doctor and the companions first witnessed the Nyssa, which is 1983. And there was a twist in this part which was covered up very, very well. So I gotta hand it to Jonathan Morris. He's usually very good with his twists, so that one was covered up pretty well. As I didn't really think that would happen, what was going on in part 1 and part 2. My mind wasn't really thinking of anything like that, and that's how you nail a good twist. Yeah, something has happened to history now, and in part 4 it reveals like there's a huge tangent in time gone down, and history's being changed. So history's been manipulated by a threat. Yeah, part 3 is absolutely brilliant. At times pacing can be a problem, but still the story feels quite a lot of tension, which I like. I didn't expect the story to have a lot of tension. But yeah, it does. The Nyssa feel like a really good threat and a monster. And a really nice twist in part 3. Part 4 was built up very well with part 3, even though that had pacing problems. Part 4 looked in a really good position. And I can say that the second half, is a lot stronger than the first half, especially part 1. I love part 2. Yeah, part 1 was, started out pretty weak, but after that the story just got on going very well, so that's absolutely wonderful. It feels quite satisfying when the second half is better than the first half. If it's the other way around, that can be very underwhelming, and it can seriously affect the score. However, I think Jonathan Morris was being a little bit clever in part 4, and I realised it. I knew this was going to happen. There was another twist in part 4 which I found very predictable. I just sensed it that it was coming. And yet there's about 5 or 6 twists in episode 4. A little bit more development on Teldak's character. She reminds me of the character, or the villain, Eldred from The Hand of Fear. And the names sound pretty similar too. She sounds a little bit mad and bloodthirsty, but she wants to completely wipe out the Nyssa for wiping out her own planet. So that makes her as bad as the Nyssa. Yeah, I won't go into her intentions. Yeah, part 4 is really good. It's like villain versus villain. I really like it. With the Nyssa and someone else who I won't say. Which is pretty good, and we have a nice twist on the Nyssa. That sort of twist has happened before. It's very similar like the warehouse in episode 4. But it makes a lot of sense when you backtrack back to the time where the Nyssa were looking for the Doctor in Amsterdam 1983, but didn't know who the Doctor was in 1658. Even though I really like part 4, it's great, it feels very clogged up. There's so much in part 4. It feels like Jonathan Morris literally crammed in everything he's forgot to put in, just stuffs it in part 4. It feels really clogged up and full. I'm like to myself, oh, my brain is hurting, there's so much going on here. Yeah, I think Jonathan Morris should have detracted some of that stuff and put it in part 3. Because, yeah, part 4 feels so clogged up. But I still like it nonetheless, and at the end of part 4, there's like a last scene with Tegan and Kyle, which of course that would happen. And that wasn't too much in your face, it was quite quick and brief, so that was pretty good. And yeah, that's the Waters of Amsterdam, the story. Now to the characters. The Fifth Doctor, Peter Davison, he was okay in part 1, just sounded a little bit bored. Maybe because the story wasn't that interesting in part 1, but the story really got moving in part 2, 3 and 4, and the Fifth Doctor, Peter Davison, felt like he was really enjoying himself. Yeah, the Doctor is very focused, very cautious of the characters such as Teldak and Kyle. Yes, performances were great when part 1 was finished. Nyssa Sarah Saturn didn't do too much, we just tagged along with the plot, but she had a really nice moment with Rembrandt about them reflecting on the past that they lost a lot. That was some really strong writing by Jonathan Morris. Tegan, a strong focus in this story. Part 1, it was really in your face, it can be quite jarring to listen to. and part 1 was pretty stale because that was the only thing driving the story. But Janet Fielding did a fantastic performance as always, and that was less of a focus now. It wasn't too much in your face with the remaining parts. Now to supporting characters, we have Kyle by Tim Della. He was a pretty good character at the start, but when he developed he sounded a little bit more interesting. There's more to him that meets the eye. And some nice twists with him in part 3 and part 4. He does really feel like a one-off companion, so yeah, he was good. Great performances. Next character is Rembrandt van Rijn, which is played by Richard James. A really fun character. His dialogue was very welcoming. He brought a lot of comedy to the story. I liked his sort of moody personality because it made just the dialogue of his really fun. A very quirky character, a lot of fun, and a strong character moment with him in part 3 with Nyssa. Teldak by Elizabeth Morton. A good character. Gets a lot better when she develops, quite interesting, but I'm not really going into her intentions. As I said, very similar to Eldrad, sort of shows herself to be a little bit too bloodthirsty to completely wipe out the Nyx, which makes her as bad as them. Polsbrook and the Nyx, who was voiced by Robbie Stevens. Polsbrook wasn't anything special, his character, but did have something quite interesting in part 4 in this tangent timeline. But that is about it, and the Nyx were a really good threat. The voices for them were brilliant. And then Glauber by Wayne Forrester, nothing really special, just served as a guard and that's it. So now to my conclusion of the Waters of Amsterdam. What did I think about it? Well, it was a really good story by Jonathan Morris. He always nails a really good story. I didn't expect it to like it this much because it isn't really Morris's style, but yet he still delivers a very good story. It's not a Jonathan Morris classic for me, but still it's very good with some tense scenes, fantastic comedy, and a real good fun adventure. Doesn't really take itself too seriously, pacing can go up and down. Part 1 was a bit stale, but it picked up in the remaining parts. Part 4 was a little bit clogged up, but still I did really like part 4. I rate The Waters of Amsterdam a 8 out of 10. Very well done to Jonathan Morris and all the cast featured in the story. Would I recommend it? Yes, I would recommend it. It's a real fun story. Definitely pick it up. Don't expect it, as I said, to be a Jonathan Morris classic, because it's not, because he always really does deliver a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 mostly all the time. But like Closest to Terror, for me, it's not a Jonathan Morris classic. Yeah, next up in the monthly range, which is already out, is Accutane by Simon Bernard and Paul Morris, which I'm very looking forward to. That's the first time they're writing for the monthly range. They're really showing themselves they are the writers, as they weren't really well known back in the day when they were producers of the Pathfinder range and they only really did one companion chronicle, but now they're really showing themselves when they've written the first story than last adventure. So thanks for watching my review of The Waters of Amsterdam, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.